Good morning, friends. Evan's wearing Texas orange. That means they won yesterday. Arch is back. It wasn't.
I get Sam Houston, so does it count?
I mean, she said it, not me. Good morning, friends. It's kind of a bit of a dreary day out there, so we're going to start with some celebration. First of all, last night was the lip sync battle, which benefits Megan's Mobile Grocery, which is a cause near and dear to my heart. If you don't know what the Mobile Grocery is, it's what it sounds like. It's a grocery that's on wheels that drives into the food deserts of our community to give people access to affordable food. Just in case anybody forgot, the Greenwood team did win. We were grand champions last year, right? Like a few of the people, a part of that team, are here today, and you can go and admire the trophy that's out on the what is that even called? The shelf as you leave today. But there is somebody present who won a battle last night, and that is Miss Sarah Hall. You did a great job. We should show a clip. Natural Elementary brought home a win and helped raise some money for a great cause. So thank you for being a part of that. Also, last week we welcomed in some new members who are here today. In case you weren't here last week, this is the Cox family. They're also over here. Thank you, Griffin. Let them know where you are. There you go. And so this is Leslie, Griffin, and Scott. We're so glad that they're a part of our church family. Here at Broadway, we dream of being a contagious community of hospitality where all people, even Tennessee fans, are welcomed into a family of faith. So it's an honor that we get to do life together, and welcome once again. Go Vols. I hear ya. Whew. We're talking about grace today. I'm going to show some of it right now. No. For the past few weeks, we've been in a sermon series about the book of Jonah, which, you hear that story, a guy in the belly of a fish, and you might think, that sounds kind of outlandish, right? Could that really happen? And we've kind of agreed together, whether or not it's fact or fiction, there is something that we can learn from this, right? However, did you know that someone actually got swallowed by a whale recently? It was off the coast of Chile, near Patagonia. There was a dad and his son that had gone out onto rafts, and while they were out there, the dad noticed that the waves were getting bigger and bigger. Marilee sent this to me, by the way. Thank you. The waves were getting bigger and bigger, and so he's like, I'm going to turn on my camera. And so he turns on his camera, and this is what he captured. So let's watch together.
This, you got to see, video to our monitors from off the coast of Chile. This is a kayaker meeting a whale, and not in the way you want to meet a whale. A kayaker chomped, in fact, right there in the water by the whale. In fact, he says he thought he was dead after that humpback whale nearly swallowed him. The young man's dad capturing it all on his phone. Here's the moment. There's the chomp. Well, his dad was saying, stay calm in the moment, like a dad does. Seconds later, that humpback whale, the humpback whale stayed calm enough to open its jaws and let the kayaker go. Thank goodness he's okay. He made it back to shore unharmed.
It's wild, right? Wild. New fear unlocked for all of us, right? But this is what he said about his experience. He said, I felt something hit me from behind. All this happened in a second. Something dark blue or white enveloped me, and a slimy texture brushed my face. Then it closed completely, and I started to sink, and I just closed my eyes, expecting an impact. But instead, I felt as if I were surrounded by water. I realized that I was in something's mouth, and I had been eaten. Oh my goodness. So, it sounds like the whale was just as surprised as the kayaker was, and so it spit him right back out. But about this young man, he said that he had never in his life seen a whale before this experience. And he said that he hoped the next time it wasn't so close up. And who can blame him, right? Now, of course, he was only in this whale's mouth and only for a few seconds. But what we discovered together last week was that Jonah was in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights, which is a pretty long time, right? But what we discovered is that while Jonah was there, gratitude was this practice that helped to expand his perspective. He sings a song in the belly of the fish that we have recorded there, in which he starts to recognize that God is present. He starts to recognize that God's providing for him and that God is preparing him as well. Now, we each week, to recap this story, we've been using our trusty felt board, which I know some people call a flannel board. We had a very lively discussion about this at 9 o'clock service. For me, it's the felt board, all right? We've been using this to go back to our childhoods a little bit so that we can remember this story together. So today I'm going to need your help, though. You all that have been here for the past couple weeks, you should have the major facts down. So tell me, where did God ask Jonah to go? Nineveh, right? Nineveh, like one of their friendly neighbors? No, right? This is an enemy of the people of Israel, constantly, trying to invade, giving them problems. They use violence, terrorism to get their way. So when Jonah is asked to go to Nineveh, he says, actually, I'm going to go the completely opposite direction. And does anybody remember where he headed? Tarshish, right? He gets on a boat. He starts sailing across the Mediterranean to what we believe is probably modern Spain is where he was going. Some scholars think that it was like a pretty happening place. It was, a place that was pretty extravagant. And it kind of like calls to mind, if you're familiar with the story of the prodigal son in the New Testament, like where he goes off to live a lavish life, perhaps. But anyway, we have Jonah. He's on this boat. He's headed toward Tarshish, going not only away from God's assignment, but he's trying to flee from God's presence itself. When all of a sudden, God does everything he can to get his attention. What does God do to get his attention? He sends a storm, which isn't hard to imagine since we had one this morning. But the waves get rough, the boat is about to break up, and whenever the sailors on the boat realize that Jonah is the source of this trouble, he eventually convinces them to do what? To throw him overboard. And we have to do the whole sequence, y'all, because this is so cute, him falling, and then he crashes into the water. And he's going down, down, down in the water. But then the text says that God provided something for Jonah. What did he provide? A big old fish that swallowed him up, right? And so he stayed there, like we just said, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of this fish, where he sings this song to God. But what I left off last week, whenever we left off here, was the very last verse of this chapter. And this is what verse 10 says. It says, "And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land." Aren't we glad we have that detail, right? Gross. And for many of us, that's where this story ends. Like when we're growing up and we're hearing the story, it's like, yay, Jonah's been saved. The end, and we close the storybook up. But there's actually 2 more chapters to this story. Now, when many of us heard this story of Jonah, a lot of times it's told to us in this way of like, to teach us this lesson that like, you better be obedient to God or else you might get swallowed by a fish, right? Like it's about trying to encourage us to do what God says. But as we've been unpacking this together, what we've been discovering is that it's much more a story about God's relentless love for us. So based on how we've heard this story, though, we might open up to chapter 3, and as he's there finally on the dry land, we might expect God to lecture Jonah, to kind of look at him and say, "Have you learned your lesson, young man?" Right? To quiz him a little bit. We might think it begins with God flexing his muscles and making sure that Jonah has really internalized just how powerful that he is. However, remember, this fish was never so much about punishment as it was about God pursuing him and trying to steer him in a better direction. And so this is how Jonah 3 actually starts. It says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I will give you." Essentially, Jonah chapter 3:1, verse 1, is very, very similar to Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. God doesn't intimidate Jonah. He doesn't indict Jonah. But instead what God does is he just invites Jonah to the same adventure that he'd already invited him to before. He looks at Jonah and he says, Jonah, I haven't given up on you. He calls him for a second time to the very first call that he'd given him in the beginning of the story. And so I want us to stop and to just think about that. God calls him, he runs away, he goes through all of this, and God's response to everything that they've been through is to look at Jonah and say, you're still my person, right? I still want to ask you to do this with me. Let's take a moment to name what is happening in that moment. That's grace, isn't it? That is goodness. That is goodness that isn't earned or deserved. That is goodness that is generous. You know, often we talk about grace and we talk about it like that it's something that God does. But in reality, grace is who our God is. Richard Rohr, he said this. He says that grace is God's first name and his job description. And it's just so true. Grace is the essence of our God. Our God who has decided in advance to love us. And not just to love us, but to love us with a committed and a loyal love, with a genuine, unshakable, immutable love, a love that pursues us and endures come what may, a love that is constantly extending to us forgiveness and seeking to mend any brokenness. And get this love is constantly doing this regardless of how we respond to it. Our God is and he does grace. Now, Jonah, he experiences this full force, right? As he is standing there on the edge of Nineveh. He is standing there. God speaks to him yet again. And after everything that's transpired, after all of the fleeing and flailing, after all of the running and the resisting, God essentially looks at Jonah and says, I still choose you, Jonah. And don't all of us long for that? Don't all of us long for someone to choose us even when we messed up? Don't all of us long for someone to see the very best in us even when we have been at our worst? Don't all of us long for someone who writes the most generous story about who we are and gives us another chance? We all long for grace. But have you ever noticed that as much as we long for that kind of grace in our lives, it's not very easy for us to give that away? Anybody else experience that? I mean, I know I have. As much as we want grace for ourselves, we tend to want others to get punishment, right? To get what they deserve, to bring down the hammer. And just to illustrate just how much I'm definitely not above having this kind of attitude, I've brought you all some fun evidence from my childhood today. There's a very famous letter that exists in my household that I grew up in that I thought had been lost to time. But alas, we found it this summer as we were cleaning some things out. Megan's laughing because she's seen it. It's a letter that reflects my deep desire for my sister to get what she has coming to her, for her to get punishment, okay? So I think I probably wrote this in like third grade, all right? So give me some grace, all right? I'm asking for your grace here. But this is what it says, and I'll read it to you because my cursive is terrible. Dear Mom and Dad, I love you, but I get in trouble for things I don't do. Things Jacqueline makes up, exclamation point, just so we're clear, right? I shouldn't be punished because Jacqueline has been grounded, but you all ungrounded her in the hour. Plus, Jacqueline gets away with everything. Love, and here's the kicker, but I know you hate me, Laura. Ooh. Talk about dramatic, right? Clearly, I wanted my parents' grace in this situation, even though I have a very immature way of asking for it. I wrote this and slipped this under their door, by the way. But I wanted the consequences of my actions to be taken away. But for my sister, what do I clearly want? I want punishment. I want retribution. I want her to get what is coming to her. Essentially, I'm saying, hey, mom and dad, bring down the hammer. Stop letting her get away with stuff. And here's my question. Have you ever prayed a prayer to God that sounds a little bit like that? Have you ever made a similar speech to him? I think if we all get a little honest, we can admit we all have a bit of this in us, right? This propensity to look at God and say, give me your grace, but those people over there, please give them punishment. Make them pay. Stephen Covey, he puts it this way. He says, we judge ourselves by our intentions and everyone else by their actions. It's a big difference, right? Imagine, this would never happen, but imagine you're driving down Scottsville Road and you accidentally cut someone off because you realize you're in the wrong lane to be able to turn where you're trying to go. And when you cut them off, you're like, oh my goodness, that was an accident. It wasn't intentional at all. Please give me your grace in this situation. But if somebody cuts you off, you're like, that was intentional and they're trying to cause an accident, right? Or your spouse goes to the grocery store, or before you go to the grocery store, maybe your spouse asks you to bring them home their favorite ice cream. And you get there and you shop and it's overwhelming. People are everywhere. And you get home and you realize you forgot the ice cream. You're like, oh, man, I just made a mistake, right? But if you ask for the ice cream and your spouse forgets to bring it home, then they clearly have a vendetta against you because you forgot to pick your socks up off the floor. I don't know. We make up some reason, right? To be.
Tell them it was out.
It was all gone. Jake, are you pulling from experience here?
Several experiences.
Well, now, buddy, your excuse is gone. It's a lot to keep up with, right? The truth is, while grace is God's bias, ours tends to be punishment. I wish I could tell you all today that our friend Jonah here is the exception, that he receives this generous grace from God in this situation, and that he rushes into Nineveh and he declares God's message with all the hope in his heart that these people are going to turn from their wickedness and they are going to find salvation. However, in truth, as we'll see more clearly next week, he goes and preaches to the people of Nineveh, hoping that they're about to get the hammer, that they're about to get punishment, that they're about to get what is coming to them. This is what verse 3 says. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city. So Jonah has heard God's request to go, and he's gone, at least part of the way into the city, not all the way across, it sounds like. What we don't get in the text is the message that God tells him to proclaim, because God says, he says, let me make sure I directly quote this. He says, I want you to go and proclaim to it the message I give you. We never really hear God's voice saying what that message is, but we definitely get at least how Jonah internalized that message. And this is what Jonah goes and he proclaims. He says, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Period. Shortest sermon ever. I know you wish Jonah were your preacher today. But clearly, Jonah extends to them zero grace, right? He goes in. This is his enemy, the people who show them, who use violence, who are aggressive towards them, who use terrorism in their attacks on other people. And so as he goes in there, while Jonah might be grateful for God's grace in his own life, he wants the people of Nineveh to get what they have coming to them for their actions, right? And so he says, 40 more days, and you will be overthrown. And we all know what Jonah means by that word when he uses it. In the words of my youngest son, Sam, overthrown means you're cooked, right? You're finished. You're done, destroyed. His bias comes through loud and clear. But here's what's so interesting. Even this message that he declares, God's grace like sneaks in there. You see that word that's translated as overthrown? More generally, what that word means is to turn. It means to reverse, to have a change of heart. And so Jonah, he announces judgment in this way, but God's grace is louder still. This is what verse 5 says. The Ninevites believed God. So they trusted that this message was true. They, in a way, supported and affirmed this message from God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. You know, you would think that when this foreign prophet comes into this town, someone that they've probably never met before, and he proclaims this message, that the people of Nineveh would hear it and they would just kind of like shrug it off, right? They'd be like, this guy's just a lunatic. Like, where did he come from? Why should we listen to him? But instead, what we see is they hear this message and they believe it. They believe that God could and he would judge them. And so their response is to turn, to reverse, to have a change of heart. They humble themselves before God in a number of ways, but not just the common people. Even the king himself does this. The text continues, it says, when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. So this is his orders to his people. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently upon God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Again, this is the decree of the king. Not just to the people, but even to the animals, y'all. This is like a way of saying, like, we are serious about this. Like, we need everybody on board. And so he says, like, everybody's supposed to fast. You're supposed to abstain from food and drink as a way to, like, put aside this time to urgently call upon God. And then they're to put on sackcloth. So you're going to exchange your normal clothes for this very scratchy material, so that every time that you move, you can be reminded of your discomfort. They're going to cover themselves with ashes, this continual reminder of their mortality. However, they're not just going to do all these things that indicate that they are repenting, but rather they are going to actually, it says they're going to turn. They're going to give up their evil ways and violence. And after they've done all that, then they say, like, that's all we can do. We leave this up to God, right? Who knows? Maybe he'll relent and show us compassion. And so here's Jonah. He comes into Nineveh announcing their judgment. But God is who he is, and he does what he does. He shows his bias, and he gives them grace instead. The chapter concludes, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. Grace is God's first name and his job description. He shows the same goodness that he showed to Jonah to the people of Nineveh, the goodness that isn't earned or deserved, the goodness that is generous, the goodness that is loyal and committed, that is genuine and unshakable and immutable, the goodness that endures and persists, come what may, the goodness that is always seeking to mend any brokenness, and the goodness that is always extending forgiveness, regardless of how we respond to it. Just like with Jonah, whenever God shows this grace to the people of Nineveh, it is this bold and this beautiful moment. But can we be real for a second? As beautiful and as bold as that moment is, it is kind of rare and maybe even ridiculous when we hold it up to our human experience. When we hear like that kind of grace being extended to someone else, we might hear that and be like, isn't that nice? And like take it to be like some fairy tale. We might take it to be as outlandish as some man being able to survive in the belly of a whale. But maybe that's exactly why we struggle with grace so much. It's hard for us to grasp that it really could be real, right? It's hard for us to accept that God so freely gives grace to us. And if that's true for us, then how can we possibly extend it to others? We live in a world that says love and acceptance depend on our performance. And so when our God looks at us and says, I will always, always, always love you, we say, okay, God, but where's the catch? Or we live in this world that says an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And so when God looks at us and he says, hey, my forgiveness is endless, we hear that and we still beat ourselves up and act like we have to pay for it. We live in a world that says that your value will be judged by your worst moments. And so when God says, you are my beloved child regardless, we refuse to take on that title. We shrug it off because we don't think that we deserve it. As much as we want God and others to show us grace, it is so, so, so difficult for us to accept it. It is so, so difficult for us to embrace it and to experience its fullness in our lives because it seems so foreign. It seems so unrealistic. But here's the thing, when we start to let that grace in, when we start to believe that maybe, just maybe, it is real, it starts to turn something in us. It begins to turn our worlds upside down in the best kind of way. When we dare to believe that God really does love us as crazy much as he says he does, this turn starts, right? And we begin to become more fluent in loving others. When we dare to believe that God really does forgive us, our own capacity to forgive others expands inside of us. When we dare to believe that God really does say that we are his beloved children, and we start to enjoy all those rights and all those privileges, we start to recognize that every other person we encounter is just as much a child as we are. It isn't always this like one-time dramatic transformation. It's often something that happens a little bit and a little bit and a little bit over time. But the more we accept and the more we embrace and the more that we experience God's grace, that turn happens. And it happens a little more until eventually our bias towards punishment begins to align more and more with God's bias toward grace. And so today, I'm not going to stand up here and kind of like point my finger at you all and say, you know what? You just need to try harder to show grace to other people, right? Like, you just need to get your act together. Don't be a Jonah. Instead, what I want to do today is ask you to get curious. Do you really believe that our God already and always loves you as much as an infinite God possibly can? Do you believe that? Do you? What are the yeah buts that are kind of like popping into your head? What are the I'm not so sures that are causing you to keep God's grace at a distance? I want you to notice what's kind of like rising up in you, because here's what I suspect. I suspect that those are the very places where you might need to receive God's grace so that you can then give that grace away to others. Grace is God's first name and his job description. As we turn God loose in our lives to be who he is and do what he does, he turns our world upside down. And we begin to share his bias to give grace to others. And so let's just invite God to do that in our lives today. If you're willing, I'd like to ask you to close your eyes and just like kind of like cup your hands in your lap like you're ready to receive something. As if we're ready to receive this grace that God indeed is already holding out to us. This is a prayer from from Kate Bowler, someone whose blessings I return to again and again. But would you receive this blessing today? Blessed are we, the graced, we who don't deserve it, whose failures haunt us, the things we said, the things we left unsaid, the decisions and addictions and broken relationships that have ripple effects we still feel today. Somehow, we are the recipients of this mysterious gift. Grace doesn't erase the pain or harm we've caused, but grace is still for us, the redeemable. And if we are, by implication, that means they are too. Yes, even them, the rude, the estranged, the unforgiven, the selfish, and the unrepentant. Despite what we have all done and left undone, we are graced. Blessed are we who live here in this mystery, in this scandal of grace.